The Russian campaign is an award-winning strategic board war game of the Eastern Front during World War II, during the period 1941 to 45. The unit scale is German Corps and Russian armies and roughly covers the Berlin to Gorki region and Archangel to Grozny. A full campaign game covers the June 1941 to June 1945 period, but numerous shorter scenarios are commonly played. The system features a double impulse movement system that simulates the German armored blitzkrieg into Russia, with mass breakthroughs and encirclements. The rules cover unit production with Russian worker units, Stuka units representing German airstrikes, partisans, rail movement, and weather rules. There are also several smaller scenarios detailing key periods during the campaign. This game was the 1976 winner of the Charles S. Roberts Award for Best Strategic Game. It is considered by many experienced war game players to be a classic war game, and is still widely played in organized competition at conventions and email tournaments. Components. The game map represents the portions of the Western Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries where the military campaign took place. It is overlaid by a hex grid to standardize movement, and each hex is about 55 kilometers across. Each turn of the game covers 2 months of the campaign, beginning with the German invasion on June 22, 1941. The Russian campaign came in a color-printed cardboard box, with a fold-out, cardboard-backed game board, order of battle cards giving the unit deployments for the German and Russian players, a sheet of 225 chits, a set of rules, and a 6-sided die. The terrain types on the map include mountains, woods, swamp, rivers, and the Black and Baltic Sea coasts. The map also includes significant cities, national boundaries, Russian military district boundaries, as well as the major rail networks. The die-cut cardboard counters are colored according to nationality, with field gray for German, light olive for German allies and black for German SS units. Russian tank corps and guard armies are printed in a lighter yellow than the Russian cavalry and regular infantry. Each of the counters is printed with unit-specific information. This information includes the unit type, size, designation, combat factor, setup information, and a movement factor. The unit type is indicated by a standard symbol, and the available types are armor, cavalry, infantry, mountain, paratroop, and panzer grenadier. There are also markers for Russian partisans and worker units, and for German Luftwaffe troops. Most Russian units, apart from those that set up in cities in the interior of the USSR, are set up in the Baltic, Western, Kiev and Odessa military districts, within boundaries shown on the map. Several potential Russian setups were published in the Avalon Hill General magazine. Most German forces set up in Germany, although some German forces set up in Romania. Up to 3 of a player's corps, or 2 armies, can be stacked together at the end of a turn. Each of these unit counters has a zone of control, consisting of the 6 hexes surrounding its current location. As the units are moved about the map during gameplay, they must cease movement for the turn when they enter a zone of control of one of their opponent's units. Gameplay. A game of the Russian campaign is normally played between 2 players, with one playing the side of Germany and its allies, and the other playing the side of Russia. The game is played in a series of turns, with the German player performing a sequence of actions followed by the Russian player repeating the same sequence. After the German player has rolled to determine the weather, the game sequence proceeds as follows. Move your unit's position, air units check for reinforcements, withdrawals, etc. Railroad movement. Attack enemy units. Second impulse. Move units not in enemy zone of control. Attack enemy units, check if your units are out of supply. The Russian player then repeats the same sequence, although with less mobility, as regular Russian infantry are not eligible to move on the second impulse, and Russian tank units may only move 2 hexes on the second impulse. Units are moved across the map by spending one or more of their movement allowance points to move from one hex to another hex. If a hex contains significant terrain, such as mountains, then movement ceases upon entry. Movement is limited under certain weather conditions, determined by a die roll each turn. For example, mud weather limits first impulse movement to 2 hexes for all units and prevents second impulse movement. Other weather types include light mud and snow, which halves all first impulse movement for all units and limits second impulse movement to 1 hex. Snow always occurs in January, February, but may also occur in November, December or March, April. The effect of weather rolls has a huge impact on the game, especially in 1941, when the German player might stymie his advance by rolling mud in the autumn, yet also has a slim chance of rolling clear weather through to the end of the year, greatly increasing his chances of capturing Moscow. A common house rule to reduce the roll of luck was to roll separately for each impulse, giving a slight advantage to the Russian player who would know in advance what the weather for each impulse would be. Other proposals were aired in the General magazine, while the L2 edition uses a running die roll modifier in which bad weather makes good weather more likely in following turns, and Russian replacements are increased slightly in good weather and reduced in bad weather. If a unit ends its movement in a zone of control of the opponent's units, then those units must be attacked. Each attack is performed separately by adding up the combat factors of the player's attacking units, then dividing by the combat factor of the opponent's units being attacked. This is then rounded down to a simple ratio, such as 2 to 1, 1 to 3, or 5 to 1. Higher odds improved the odds for a successful attack. Terrain features generally favored the defender by doubling their combat factor. Odds of 10 to 1 ensured an automatic victory, enabling the enemy unit to be removed straight away from the game during the movement phase and perhaps opening up a corridor that other friendly units might pass through. The results of an attack are determined by rolling a 6-sided die and then finding the results on the combat results table. The results range from the attacking units being eliminated up to the surrender of the defending units. Between these extremes there are a range of intermediate results, including retreat by the attacker or defender, an exchange of losses, a combination of unit losses and a retreat, or contact, meaning that the units simply remain adjacent to one another, with further combat being thus inevitable in the next turn. Supply plays an important role during the game. Combat units must be able to trace a supply line to a friendly city or rail line. Units out of supply have their combat rating halved. The first and second winter in Russia is particularly difficult for the German side, as supply is severely hindered during that period for units that are not close to a city. German air supremacy early in the war, initially overwhelming but diminishing over time, is depicted by the use of Stuka units. In 1941 the German player receives 3 Stukas, or 1 in mud turns, whereas in 1942 he receives 2 Stukas, or 1 in mud turns, and in 1943 1 Stuka in clear turns only. Stukas are never available in snow turns. Each Stuka must trace its air range to one of the 3 German Army Group headquarter counters. Adding a Stuka unit to a combat shifts the odds by 3 in the Germans' favor, i.e., a 2 to 1 becomes a 5 to 1 attack. The game also includes 3 optional Russian artillery units, each of which shifts the odds by 1, for use in the latter stages of the game, as well as a single German artillery unit available in 1942. The L2 version of the game allows the Russians to receive air support from Sturmovik units late in the game. The Russian player has 3 paratroop units, which may only drop during winter turns, and that must be dropped within range of the Russian STAVKA headquarters unit. Paratroops are weak, but may be useful in cutting off German retreat. The Russian player also has 3 partisan counters, which may be deployed to cut railway lines, but that may not be deployed near an SS unit. The game also contains rudimentary rules for seaborne movement and invasions in the Black Sea and Baltic Sea. Hitler and Stalin, who may only move by rail, are also shown as counters in the game. Like STAVKA and the 3 German army group headquarters, Hitler and Stalin are each assumed to have a combat strength of 1. Each player has a schedule of reinforcements. Most German forces are present on the map to begin with, although some appear later in the game, including most of the SS Corps. Italian units are removed in September 1943 at the point where the Western Allies are deemed to have landed in Italy. The German player also receives extra reinforcements at Warsaw and Bucharest when the Russians draw near to these cities, or in the far north if Leningrad is captured by the Germans. Russia's forces are initially weak, but many new infantry armies are received in the autumn of 1941, and guards armies at regular intervals thereafter. The Russian player starts the game with a 3-factor worker unit in Moscow, and 2-factor worker units in Leningrad, Kiev, Kharkov and Stalino, but receives 9 more worker units over the first year or so of the war. The German player may replace one of each type of unit each year, although he may replace 1 Panzer Corps for each of the 3 oil wells on the map he controls, which means that unless he captures the 2 oil wells in the Caucasus, he is limited to replacing 1 Panzer Corps for the oil well at Plosta in Romania. All SS units may be replaced automatically. The Russian player receives replacement points each turn, 1 for each worker factor, and also between 1 and 6 replacement points, determined by a die roll, of Allied aid via Murmansk. In the L2 edition this has now been fixed at 3 extra points per turn. Only 1 Russian tank unit, and 1 Guard infantry army, may be replaced each turn. In 1943 the value of the Russian worker units is doubled, representing greater industrial mobilization and greater Allied Lend-Lease aid via Persia and Vladivostok. Generally, the Germans have more powerful and more mobile units and are able to usually get more favorable odds in combat. But the Russians are able to recreate their destroyed armies at a much faster and can thus afford the higher casualty rate that comes with the lower combat odds. The game's victory conditions have evolved slightly over the years. In the Avalon Hill version, victory was obtained by capturing the enemy capital and eliminating the enemy leader counter, or by capturing all enemy cities. The game also contains sudden death victory conditions, by which each player may secretly select one of a menu of victory conditions that varied from year to year, and wins the game outright by controlling both his own and the enemy objective. Under these rules, the game, if it followed the exact course of history, would end early in 1943 as the Russian player would control both Stalingrad and the oil well at Mykop. Avalon Hill also published Fortress Europa, covering the Western Front from June 1944 to the end of the war. Although on a slightly different scale, the game was based on an essentially similar system to the Russian campaign, and indeed began with the German player setting up his divisions inside army districts along the French coast, similar to the Russian setup in military districts in the Russian campaign. Fortress Europa is currently due for republication by L2 Design Group. In the mid-1980s, Avalon Hill also published Russian Front, a game covering almost exactly the same topic as the Russian campaign, but with slightly more detail to the air war and very different combat mechanics. The game also looked very different as it featured a state-of-the-art painted map board. L2 Design Group developed Russia Besieged based on the designer's experience with Russian campaign. Similar in scale and scope, it adds additional chrome to the rules to provide additional realism to the simulation of this conflict. Development history. First edition, Jedco Games, John Edwards, 1974. Second edition, Avalon Hill, Don Greenwood, 1976. 3rd edition. Avalon Hill, Richard Hamblin, 1977. 4th edition. L2 Design Group, Tom Gregorio, 2003. Southern expansion. L2 Design Group, Art Lupinacci, 2004, an extension map covering the Caucasus and included additional rules and variants.